Hello, my friends. So today is November 7th, and this is my November FOMC debrief. So first, let's level set a little bit. The last time we had a Fed meeting, we had a supersized 50 basis point cut. At that time, the market was also anticipating another supersized cut by the end of the year. The market was concerned about a potential recession. But between then and now, the data has come in much better than expected. Notably, a couple months ago, we had a blowout jobs report. And since then, the ISM survey data has also been pretty upbeat. And so the market doesn't seem to be very concerned about a potential recession. And heading into the meeting today was pricing in just one 25 basis point cut and less confidently a 25 basis point cut in December. So today, the Fed did cut by 25 basis points as expected. But what people really wanted to know was how the presidential election the past week is factoring into the Fed's thinking. So as we all know, President Trump won the election and also won the popular vote and looks like he's going to sweep Congress as well. So there's a perception that the President Trump has a popular mandate and may potentially implement some big changes. So that's what basically Chair Powell was asked about. Now, so let's go over a few things that I found were interesting. Well, first off, now President Trump during the campaign, of course, when you're on the campaign, you say many things. Sometimes you mean them, sometimes you don't. But based on what was being said on the campaign, many people perceived President Trump to be someone who would spend a whole bunch of money, a lot of deficit spending and so forth. And I think that's part of the reason that the market is pricing fear cuts as well. So people wanted to know what Chair Powell thought about that. Is that impacting how he goes about doing monetary policy? Let's hear what he has to say.
In the near term, the election will have no effects on our policy decisions. As you know, many things affect the economy, and anyone who writes down forecasts in their job will tell you that the economy is quite difficult to forecast looking out past the very near term. Here, we don't know what the timing and substance of any policy changes will be. We therefore don't know what the effects on the economy would be, specifically whether and to what extent those policies would matter for the achievement of our goal variables, maximum employment and price stability. We don't guess, we don't speculate, and we don't assume.
So basically, it doesn't really change anything in the near term. And going forward, he's going to have to look carefully at the legislation and see how things pan out. So legislation is something that takes a long time, and also you don't really know what the ultimate impact is. Now, historically, the Fed doesn't actually conduct monetary policy in advance of what they perceive a fiscal policy to do. So I think if we do have tremendous amounts of fiscal spending and a big growth and inflation wave, the Fed is probably not going to do anything in anticipation of that. They're going to wait and actually see it in the data. After all, it's really hard to know when it's just being discussed by Congress what legislation will actually do to the economy. Another thing, interestingly, was Chair Powell was asked about his views on the rising 10-year yield. So as we all know, the Fed has been cutting rates, but at the same time, we see the 10-year yield rising, and that could be perceived to be, tightening financial conditions, especially when you look at things like the housing market. Mortgage rates look like they're above 7% again. This is what Chair Powell had to say.
I just think the first question is how long will they be sustained? If you remember the 5% 10-year, people were drawing massively important conclusions only to find, 3 weeks later the 10-year was 50 basis points lower. So, it's material changes in financial conditions that last, that are persistent, that really matter. And we don't know that about these. What we've seen so far, we're watching it, we're reading, we're doing the decompositions and reading others, but right now it's not a major factor in how we're thinking about things.
So basically, he doesn't really think about it. So 10-year yield goes up and sometimes it goes down. If it were to stay at an elevated level, then Chair Powell would be thinking about it. But he points to the fact that last year, 10-year yield got up to 5% briefly. Everyone was freaking out. And then the yield came tumbling down. So right now, he doesn't really think about the 10-year yield. Another thing that I thought was interesting was, why is Chair Powell cutting rates at all, given that the economy seems to be on solid footing? Now, that answer seems to be because Chair Powell thinks that inflation is done for. Let's hear his response.
And you also look at the economy and you say, what is the inflation story now? Where's it coming from? So I point to a couple of things. One is the non-housing services and goods, which together make up 80% of the core PCE index, are back to the levels they were at the last time we had sustained 2% inflation, which happens to be in the early 2000s for a period of 5, 6, 7 years. So they're back to that level. What's not is housing services. So let's talk about housing services. Housing services is higher. What's going on there is, market rents, newly signed leases are experiencing very low inflation. And what's happening is older, leases that are turning over are taking several years to catch up to where market rent leases are. So that's just a catch-up problem. It's not really reflecting current inflationary pressures. It's reflecting past inflationary pressures.
So basically, Chair Powell is breaking down inflation into a few components. Notably, he says that supercore inflation, which is services inflation excluding housing, which is what is the predominant driver in any measure of inflation in the U.S., being a services-oriented economy. Looking at supercore, it's basically at inflation rates that are comparable to pre-pandemic. The reason that inflation is still above the Fed's 2% target is because of shelter inflation. And shelter inflation, as we all know, is measured in a way that it lags. So for example, let's say today you signed a new lease, rent goes up a lot, okay? But then from that time forward until you renew your lease, maybe 12 months in the future, your rent is frozen. So a lot of the increase in rental inflation and shelter inflation we were seeing are basically leases signed in the past. Now, he's noting that rental agreements today are showing very limited increases in rent. And so he's thinking that if you just take that into account and note that shelter inflation is lagging, then inflation is basically over and we don't have to have rates where we are today. And so he's been cutting them. And again, of course, disinflation could be transitory. We don't know. And the last thing that I want to talk about that I thought was super interesting was, of course, the questions on Fed independence. So as we all know, when Trump was president in 2018, I think he had a very public feud with Chair Powell, oftentimes thinking that Chair Powell was not doing a good job. And throughout the campaign, there have been suggestions that maybe a Trump administration would, like to have a bit more control over Fed policy. So again, Chair Powell was pointedly asked if he was asked to resign, would he do so? Let's hear what he said.
Some of the president-elect's advisors have suggested that you should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Can you follow up on, do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No.
Mike?
Very determined, very, very determined answer. I think that Chair Powell thinks that he's doing a very important job. He is very, very careful to protect the Fed's independence. And so he gave a very strong answer saying that he's going to be standing here no matter what the executive does. Again, there was actually another question on this as well. Basically, what would happen? What if, let's say, instead of firing Powell, maybe what if they just demoted him so that he wasn't Fed chair anymore? This is his answer.
Do you believe the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
Thank you.
Courtney.
So basically, Chair Powell is asserting that that would be illegal. Now, to be clear, with the control of Congress, they can always change the law, again, if they want to. So anyway, what I take away from that is that Chair Powell is resolutely standing up for the independence of the Fed as he sees it, and so he does not want to be pressured by any elected government. Now, overall, I thought today's conference was dovish, simply because Chair Powell seemed pretty confident that inflation was over and he wanted to get to something closer to neutral. And of course, he noted that he would take his time getting there. So it's not like he's going to be cutting rates a lot, but there really isn't any indication here today that he wanted to signal a more hawkish stance. All right, so that's all for today. I'll talk to you guys on Saturday.